Hey everyone, welcome back to week 8, part A. So in this video, we are going to cover object-oriented programming. Alright, so what is object-oriented programming? Well, first thing I want to point out is that a lot of people will use the shorthand version, which is just OOP. So OOP is object-oriented programming. Something that I do want to point out is that we're only going to cover key terms and concepts for this. So we're not actually going to get into what the code for it looks like. Couple reasons for that. One, because this is starting to become a little bit of an intermediate topic, but I feel like the concepts and the ideas behind it, they're not super intermediate. Like, we can definitely cover that in this class. But if you do continue on with the CSC courses here at North, so for example, if you take CSC 142 next quarter, that will focus a lot on object-oriented programming. So this is sort of to help you sort of get a jump on those concepts so that if and when you do take that class, you have sort of a background sort of idea of what's already going on. The cool thing about these sort of terms and concepts that we're going to cover is, since we're not going to talk about code, these terms and concepts that we talk about, they're going to apply to any language that uses object-oriented programming. So yes, there is a way to code this stuff specifically in Python. We won't cover that. The book does cover it though, if you do want to look into it and if you are interested in learning it. But all these key terms and concepts that we're going to talk about today, that applies for any language that you might be writing in that allows you to write using object-oriented programming. Alright, so let's get into it. So object-oriented programming, so again, shorthand for that is OOP. It's basically a programming style. So it's a way that you can sort of program. So the style is basically defined by categorizing tasks into collaborating objects. So the idea is that you're going to write a bunch of code organized into objects. Now again, we're not going to actually write code, but you get the idea. So each object sort of has two pieces. It has its own set of data, which is basically any values that you want, any type. And then it also is going to have methods, which can act upon the data. So the object itself has its own data, and it can have methods that do things to the data. Alright, so let's define what a method is. So again, each object has its own set of data and has methods that can act upon the data. A method is a lot like functions. Now, something that I do want to be careful about saying, methods and functions are two different things, but they act very similarly. Basically, the difference is that methods you apply to objects. Functions are applied to things that are not objects. But the idea is sort of the same. They are actions. They are things that you can do in your code. And you can write your own methods. There are some methods that are already built into Python. In fact, anything that is a function call that we've talked about in this class so far that was like something dot something else, those are actually all methods. So everything from the turtle library, those are all methods, because you would do name of turtle dot forward, for example. A lot of the string stuff, like string dot strip, those are all methods applied to objects, which are strings. So again, methods are like functions, but they are applied to objects. So they're not quite the same, but they are similar. Alright, so let's also talk about classes. So a class basically describes a set of objects with the same behavior. So again, the idea behind object-oriented programming is that you organize your code into different sort of objects. So you can think of objects as sort of buckets or different sort of examples of things. And again, objects are going to have their own data, own methods, all that sort of stuff. And a class is kind of like a type for an object, right? So when we talked about types this quarter, we talked about string types, integer types, whatever, but there are specific strings. Like, for example, if I type the string hello, with quotes, that's a specific string. So when we're dealing with objects, objects are going to be specific examples, and then classes are sort of the type. Classes are sort of a generalized category for these different objects. So classes are what you use to code object-oriented programming. So when you actually code stuff with object-oriented programming, you'll actually be using this word class, and yeah. Again, if you are interested in seeing the code for it, check out the book. Let's talk about an example. I think, I've been throwing a lot of terminology out at you. It'll make more sense with an example. So let's say we make a class called point. So the idea behind this class is that it deals with points on, say, the XY coordinate plane. So the class is going to sort of define what data you hold in the objects, and then also what methods can be applied to the object. So again, it's sort of giving you a standardization or a sort of categorical idea of what these objects are going to look like. So again, let's work with this example class point. So some data that might exist for any object of class point would be an x coordinate or a y coordinate, right? Every point is going to have an x coordinate and a y coordinate. So that's some data that might be in your class here. Methods that might be of your point class would be maybe a method that calculates the distance from a point to the origin, maybe one that calculates distance between 2 points, so on. So these are, again, these are actions. So these are kind of like functions, but they're functions specifically that are applied to objects. Alright, so now let's talk about instances. So when you make an object of a certain class, so again, classes are sort of like the types, and then objects are kind of like the values, but they're slightly more complex values because they themselves can have a bunch of values. So when you create an object of a certain class, when you make a specific object of a category of a class, this is what we call an object instance. A lot of people will just call it instance. So if you hear this term instance, it basically means object instance. It's a specific object with concrete details on it. And then every object instance is going to have its own instance variables. So these are going to be variables that store data for that particular object instance. So again, if we go back to this point class example, so again, class is sort of like a category. It's like a type. It's a very sort of broad category. But I could, for example, make a specific point. Say the point 1, 4. Now that specific point would be an example of an object instance. This is an instance of the class point. This is a specific point. And everything in class point, all the different objects, all the different object instances, they're all going to have an x and y coordinate value, but the second you set it to a specific value for your specific instance, so in our example, our specific point is the point 1, 4, the instance variables then would be, hey, we're setting x to be 1, and we're setting y to be 4. So again, the instance variables are variables that you can think of it as, their scope is their particular object instance. So again, in this class, you can have a bunch of different points. Let's pick out a specific one, 1, 4. That is a specific object instance. This object instance has instance variables x and y such that x is set to 1 and y is set to 4. Here's another example that you could do with classes. So let's say you have a vehicle class. Right? There's a bunch of different types of vehicles, and even though they're all different, they all share similar things. So some data that all vehicles might share would be color. Right? Every vehicle is going to have a color. Every vehicle is going to have some number of tires, number of seats. You can get creative with this. Some methods that are going to be applied to any vehicle would be drive, or honk, or turn left, turn right. So again, the data are the nouns, and then the methods are the actions. And then if we want to get specific, if we wanted a specific example of a vehicle, then we can make an object instance. So for example, my Mini Cooper, that is a specific vehicle, right? If I say, go find my Mini Cooper, there's going to be one car that fits that description. Versus go find any vehicle, there's going to be lots of cars that fit that description. So an object instance is a specific one. My Mini Cooper, or, my mom's car, her Ford Flex, or whatever she has now. And then an instance variable would essentially be the variable of a particular object instance, let's say my Mini Cooper, that now has a specific value. So for example, my Mini Cooper is blue. So an instance variable example would be the data color for my specific object instance, for my specific vehicle, Mini Cooper, is going to be set to blue. So this is another example of, sort of how these different terminologies sort of work together to potentially create some really awesome code in the long run. So what I want you to do now is make up your own class. Now again, this is just, there's no code here. Just come up with an example of a class, something that is sort of like a broad category, and then provide examples of data and methods in your class. Now these are going to be sort of general examples. These are things that can apply to anything that exists in your class. And then I want you to get specific. So then provide, let's say, at least 2 object instances of your class. So provide at least 2 specific examples. And for one of those specific examples, go ahead and provide a couple of instance variables, right? So go ahead and say, oh, the data for this particular object is this. So go ahead and do that. And if you do feel inclined, feel free to post your example to the discussion forum. Go ahead and post it to the, if you have course questions here, post them here. Go ahead and post it there. And you can even, if you really want to pose it as a question, be like, hey, what do you guys think of my class that I made up? But yeah, go ahead and do this. That said, this is all I have for you for this video. So like I said, we're not covering any code for this topic. If you do want to see examples of code, though, the book does have some. But again, the main takeaway here is that you understand sort of the concept behind classes, that they're sort of categories, and you should be comfortable with all these definitions. So just make sure these definitions make sense. Again, I think they're best sort of understood through an example. So hopefully you were able to create your own class. But as usual, if you do have any questions, please do let me know.